All right, let's go ahead and get started on this. This is the federal, we're going to talk about the Federal Convention today, also known as the Constitutional Convention today, but back then it was just called the Federal Convention. And then we're going to talk about this Constitution that they built and some of the big topics and key ideas within it. So let's get right into this. So we're going to be talking about some of the main points and authors of specifically the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, because a lot of those were influenced by Virginians. We're going to talk about the difference between a Federalist, someone who supported the Constitution, and an Anti-Federalist, someone who opposed it, what their arguments were for and against ratification or approval of the Constitution. We're going to talk about that ratification or approval process. And at the end, we're going to get to the big main ideas within the Constitution. So this Federal Convention was called in the summer of 1787. Basically, from the last time we talked, it was the Articles of Confederation weren't working. Shay'a Rebellion scared a lot of people, especially the rich people, and they were worried about what was going to happen. So 55 delegates from 12 states showed up in Philadelphia. Rhode Island did not attend. These men were very well educated. They were all wealthy. They were landowners, lawyers, plantation owners, and they were all men. And their purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation. And I'll change that spelling later on. So some key people that we're going to talk about from Virginia specifically. James Little Jimmy Madison. That was his real nickname. He was only about 5'4". He wasn't very tall, 5'2". He was from Virginia. He is considered the father of the Constitution. And we'll talk about why. He came in with a plan that he had researched and drafted up. So he came with an idea. He debated it. He debated for and against it. Why it was important. Why those things against it weren't as important as why it was good. And he was also the father of the Bill of Rights. He also debated in Virginia to get Virginia to approve it, because Virginia was a very key state within the approval process. And he wrote the Bill of Rights, and we'll talk about why they're separate to the Constitution. So Little Jimmy Madison is a very important person. George Washington, he was president of the Constitutional Convention. He only spoke twice. He knew that, this is what James Madison wrote, George Washington knew that if he spoke on something or shared his position or his thoughts on it, everybody else would say, you're very smart, you just won the war. Everybody respected him, so they would have gone with him, and he knew he wasn't as smart as 54 other people together working on an idea. So that's why he only spoke twice. He listened. The only time he really spoke and said anything substantive was at the end when he said, and I'm going to paraphrase, there are parts of this Constitution I like, parts that I think we can work on, but basically it's a good start and we can change it if we need to. So he said it was a good thing for the country. He was in favor of a strong government anyway. But pretty much everybody knew that he would be picked to lead the new government. Edmond Randolph, who was the governor of Virginia at the time, he presented James Madison's plan. George Mason, from right up here in Northern Virginia, he was the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which protected individuals' rights within the state of Virginia, that a government cannot impose their will on somebody's rights. And he demanded a Bill of Rights, or those rights be put into the Constitution. Matter of fact, he left the Constitutional Convention and came home and didn't sign it. And then he argued very much against the Constitution, but eventually agreed once they agreed to put a Bill of Rights in. From Pennsylvania, old Ben Franklin, smart guy. He was the oldest delegate, but he was well respected. And he could help calm down arguments between the two parties. He was a voice of calm and compromise and reason. From New York, was Alexander the Ham Hamilton. That's our nickname. He was very much for the Constitution. A lot of the people from New York weren't. He wound up being the only delegate to sign from New York. He helped write the Federalist Papers, which we are going to talk about later on. and that was designed to help persuade or convince the public opinion. Those people who you might think about but did not attend. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. He was a strong voice against the Constitution. He did not like it. He thought it would lead to tyranny, or which tyranny is basically another word for domination or oppression. He debated Madison very much in the Virginia Parliament, in the Virginia Congress, House of Burgesses. And Madison won, but Patrick Henry was very much an anti-Constitution person. Thomas Jefferson, old T.J. Diddy, he was accepted ambassador to France because he spoke French fluently, and he was brilliant. He was he would eventually become our third president, but he was an anti-federalist as well. He favored a weak central government and strong state governments. And he was the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which talked about being able to practice whatever religion you wanted, as well as, and most importantly, the state could not favor a specific religion. So let's get into how they developed and ratified this Constitution, ratifying being another word for approve. Virginia had a lot of influence on this. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, again written by George Mason right there, it reiterated or restated or said again the notion that basic rights, life, liberty, happiness, property, whichever one you want to put it in, should not be violated by the governments. The Virginia Statute, another word for that is law, for religious freedom written by Thomas Jefferson, outlawed, that means to make against the law, the established church. That is the favorite practice of government support for one church. Remember, the government of England, the official Church of England was the Anglican Church. The church gave money, the state gave money to it. Thomas Jefferson said, no, the government should not support or favor any church. People should not feel that they have to be a member of the church to get things done. They can practice whatever faith they want. James Madison, when he started drafting the Bill of Rights, which we'll cover later, he looked at both of these documents. He was good friends with both of these men beforehand and even afterwards. Matter of fact, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson lived only about 20 miles apart and would spend a lot of time at each other's homes talking and debating. But James Madison looked at both of these when he drafted the Bill of Rights. So Virginia had a lot of big influence on the Constitution. So who are these Federalists? Again, they favored the Constitution. They favored a strong national government with power. Remember in the Articles of Confederation, it was a weak national government, it didn't work. They argue that checks and balances, which I'll cover in a minute, it's basically two-man control. No one branch has too much power. Somebody can always do something to correct that power. The strong government needs to facilitate or to coordinate interstate and foreign trade, national defense, foreign relations. That's what they worry about. That was their argument. And the Bill of Rights was not needed. They were like, hey, we just fought a war for these things. These are obvious. You don't have to tell anybody that you have the right to free speech or the right to not have military stationed in your home. That's obvious. Anybody can figure it out. So they said it was not needed, that the Constitution protected those rights because the people governed themselves. Most states already had a basic Bill of Rights, so why put one in the federal Constitution? And Washington himself was against the Bill of Rights, or against putting the rights in the Constitution. I probably ought to update my slide, but that's okay. He said they were fairly obvious. The Anti-Federalists opposed the Constitution that we came up with. They were in favor of strong state governments and believed that a national government would take power from the states. They didn't like a strong government. They believed a national Bill of Rights is necessary because they wanted consistency among all the colonies. That if I had freedom of religion in Virginia, if I went to New Hampshire, I should still have freedom of religion, as an example. And they forced the Federalists to agree to add a Bill of Rights. It's Congress's first task, and the Bill of Rights was approved 2 years later after the Constitution, which is pretty fast. And then a lot of them supported the Constitution, but the Bill of Rights was really their sticking point. So to support the two positions, the groups of writers would start writing things. And the first one we're going to talk about is the Federalist Papers. They were written to win approval of the Constitution, especially in New York and Virginia too, but especially in New York, because a lot of the delegates left. Only one was left, Alexander Hamilton. It's recognized as the most sophisticated explanation of the American political system because all these people were in the meetings that designed the Constitution in Philadelphia. Specifically, if you want to go look at number 10 and number 84, they're the most famous and most important. But they argued that a republic could survive in an area as big as the United States because political factions or groups would keep each other in power or would check each other's power. Much like you have today, we have two big Democratic parties, and you're starting to see people unhappy with those two parties and making a third independent party or fourth independent party that are getting more, that people are looking to for power. And they argue that a national government is more important than states, but only in the areas where the Constitution or the states give that federal government their power. Now, the three folks who wrote about this were James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, so obviously he was in favor of it. Alec Hamilton, who was George Washington's military aide during the war. He was a very smart young man. He probably could have become president had he lived. And John Jay, who was very smart and was a lawyer and would actually become the first Chief Justice of the first Supreme Court. Anti-Federalists would write too. They would write papers. But why did the Federalists win? Why did public opinion and other people start to vote for this in the legislatures? Well, there was widespread opinion that the Articles of Confederation were bad. Something needed to replace them. I'm not sure what, but something had to happen. Shay'a Rebellion played a large part in that. The Federalists had a plan. They had the Constitution. James Madison came into the door with an idea. And a lot of people are like, well, this sounds good. I don't have to think. How can we change it? They may not have been happy with the plan, but they had always, and that's a life lesson, always go into something with an idea. And if you go into it, that's generally the one that's accepted and modified a little bit. The Federalists had a national network to talk. They would write. They would publish the Federalist Papers. George Washington is a Federalist. He chaired the convention. He wasn't power hungry. Everybody knew him, and they knew he'd probably be the first president or the leader of this new thing. But after the convention, people talked to him, and he convinced people. And then you had the Federalist Papers, which you've already talked about. They were widely published. So how does this ratification process work? Well, 9 of 13 states would need to ratify or agree. And that had to be done at state conventions, not the legislatures. Many feared losing power and would vote no. And there were big debates. Delaware was the first to approve it very fast. That's why if you see their license plate, they call themselves the first state. And it took a little while. Delaware was the first state. New Hampshire was the 9th. And they adopted on the 21st of June, 1788. So that officially made everybody part of it, and all the 13 eventually came into play. Rhode Island was at last. New York and Virginia don't agree immediately. They're big states, very populated, so that's 2 times as big in size, land and people. The Constitution probably would have failed without them. Hamilton of New York and Madison convinced their states' legislatures to approve, and it was tough. In 79, the Constitution goes into effect. North Carolina in 88, and Rhode Island was the last 1790 to ratify, so they became the 13th state at that point. And then the Bill of Rights. It's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It took effect in 1791. It was one of the first things that James Madison, who was a representative to the first Congress, promised. He delivered, and it protects basic rights. But of basic rights, which means any white male who's old enough, was 18, and they had land. But you've got a trial by jury. You can't have your property seized without your notification. You have trial by jury, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, freedom or right to bear arms, and most importantly, the 10th Amendment, which basically says anything not listed in this Constitution is a state right. So now let's talk about this document they approved. There were several issues of debate. How is representation going to be set up? Specifically, slavery was a big question. What would Congress look like? Who would be represented, the states or the people? And how would the government be structured? What is it going to look like? And what power would it have? So one of the things that happened was this great compromise. It settled the representation question. You may hear it sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise, but we're just going to go with the Great Compromise. Two plans. The Virginia plan that James Madison came in with Edmond Randolph, said we should need to have two houses, an upper and a lower house, state populations, larger number of representatives. Both houses are based on that. Legal voters in districts elect your representatives, and the people are equally represented. The New Jersey plan, looking at the small states, was by William Patterson. It said we need one house, much like the Articles of Confederation. Each state sends two representatives, much like the Articles of Confederation. State legislators choose the members of Congress, because that kind of means that the elite people do it, and states are represented equally, so much like the Articles of Confederation, which was very good for small states. So you had these two, and there's a lot of debate between them. And then Ben Franklin says something to the effect of, we need to look at this like a good carpenter. When a good carpenter has two pieces of wood he needs to put together, he takes a little from one and a little from other and puts them together and makes a nice joint for a beautiful product. And that's what they did. It's called the Connecticut Compromise because it was recommended by Roger Sherman from Connecticut. And it basically said, hey, why don't we just do both? Why don't we have two houses, one representing the people, which is what the Virginia plan was, and one representing the states, which is what the New Jersey one was. So the House, the lower one, could be based on population to make large states happy. The Senate would be based on state to make the small states happy. Legal voters can vote for the people's representatives, and the state legislatures can vote for the Senate. Now today, another amendment's been passed, and the people vote for senators instead of the state legislatures, but this is how it was then. So basically the concept is the people are equal. You've got a certain number of people represented by a representative, and the states are equal as well in the upper house, but a law has got to pass both of them. You can't just pass one, it's got to pass both. So the states and the people have to agree. Then you had the 3/5 question, or 3/5 compromise, which talked about the issue of slavery. So the question was, when counting the population for the house, who gets counted? Do slaves get counted? The issue was slaves were property. North wanted them counted because of taxes. South wanted them counted for more representatives. So the decision was, for every 5 slaves counted, 3 would be added to the population. So each slave is 3/5 of a person. So if you've got 5 slaves, 3 would count in the population. That's kind of what the math shows. And I'll show you a slide in a minute that illustrates this. Slaves are not called persons in the Constitution. They're called other persons. Slavery, but at the time, slavery is legal and is constitutional. Today we see it as reprehensible and bad, but 200 years ago it was the way the world worked in the United States. Slaves counted as property is mentioned for taxes. So the North wanted slaves counted for taxes, but they didn't want them all counted because of representation. Slave states had more representation in Congress if slaves counted. As an example, in 1790, without compromise, there were 33 representatives from slave states. With compromise, 45. That's 12 more votes they got in the House of Representatives because of the slaves. So, how did it work? And for this example, I'm using the example of one House representative for every 150,000 people. So, South Carolina, which had a population of 140,000 people at the time, had a black population of 109,000 people for a total of 249 bodies. Well, that would be one representative for 140,000 people, right? We didn't cross 150, so it's one representative in Congress. But with the 3/5 compromise, that's 140,000 white, 60% of 190 is 65,000, that's 205,000, they get 2 votes. New Jersey, with 184,000 people in 1790, has 11,000 blacks. That's 195,000 total population. That's a representative population of 2 people because it went over the 150,000. You add in the blacks, it only counts as 190. It's still 2 people. So New Jersey wouldn't change. They didn't lose anything. But South Carolina would gain because their blacks are included in the population. So what is federalism? Federalism is the dividing. So now let's get into the power. Who's going to share it? Federalism is dividing and sharing of power between the states and the federal governments. And that's an important difference. You have delegated powers. Which are only federal powers. And you have to think about it this way. The states are agreeing to this Constitution. So the states are taking their power that they have under kind of a social contract type theory. They're taking their power and delegating or giving it to the federal government to declare war, make treaties, make a standing army, coin money. Let's talk about that one. The states at this time had their own money. We mentioned that under Articles of Confederation. But under this new Constitution, everybody uses one money. One federal United States dollar, which you still see today in your pocket. And they can regulate interstate trade and commerce. Concurrent powers are powers that are shared by both. They can both do it. Both can make and enforce laws. There are federal laws and state laws. They can set up courts. There's the federal courts and the state courts and county courts. Both can collect taxes, protect health and welfare, and call out the militia. And then you have reserved powers, only for the states. The power that basically the state said, you do not touch these. These are ours. The states are going to control education. They're going to control the highways, their own election rules, even for president. The states decide how they want to elect their representatives, and a lot of them do them very differently. Example, most states you go to the polls to vote, but in Oregon, everybody votes by mail. So there are no polls on that day. You have to mail your vote in. Now let's look at separation of powers. What does it mean? There are they created 3 branches of government. So no one entity has all the power. In England, you had 2. You had a legislative branch and the king, but the king had absolute power. So that's really not separation of powers. So here we came up with 3 branches: a legislative, an executive, and a judicial. For us, the legislative is the Congress, is the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they make the laws. The executive branch, the president and the vice president, they enforce the laws. They run the government. They make sure all the laws happen and are enforced. They make sure people are following them, and they punish those that don't. Then you have the judicial. That's our Supreme Court and other federal courts, and they interpret the law. They decide, is this law legal, constitutional, or not? So how do checks and balances work? Well, this is very simple. Checks and balances keep one branch from becoming too powerful. Now, how does that happen? Well, we have our legislative branch that's making the laws, our executive branch that's enforcing, and our judicial that's interpreting the laws. So the president appoints judges to the courts. But that's a lot of power. He can appoint whoever he wants. But Congress has to approve those judges. So if they don't like the judge, or for whatever political reason, they can say no to that certain nominee. Congress passes bills to get signed by the president into law, but the president doesn't like them, he can veto them. The judicial or the Supreme Court can rule a president's actions unconstitutional and say, no, you can't do that. They can also rule laws unconstitutional or constitutional. And the Congress can also impeach or bring to trial the president for high crimes and misdemeanors against the government while he's in office. So that's kind of how the checks and balances. No one person's got all the power, and they can always be checked by somebody else. The Constitution can be changed. We're not going to get too complicated into it. There are a lot of different methods. If it's proposed by 2/3 of both houses, then 3/4 of state legislatures need to approve it. If it is done by 2/3 of a state at a national convention, then it goes to 3/4 of the houses. If it's done by 3/4 of the states at a special state conventions, then it goes to both houses of Congress. So there's different ways to do it. These can come from Congress, or they can come from the states themselves. States can say we want to change it. So in summary, there was just the greatest deliberation in the history of the Western world, putting this democratic republic that we have, this experiment that is working, very well after 200 years. It developed our current system of government that still works. It's not perfect, but it was a compromise that people were willing to agree to try it if they could change it. Virginians were very important to the success, and it created a strong government with separation of powers and checks and balances. So, hope you got something out of that. Check your notes. We'll see you in class.